Hi. This is Melanie, Yazzie. Have not recorded. Yay! Finally back. Haven't recorded an episode in like 2 months, which is really sad. The arm of my little podcast setup, my little mic setup here, is actually covered in dust because it was in one of those things that you put on top of your car when you travel a lot, like one of those crates or whatever, those boxes, a cargo box. That's what it's called. So my podcast equipment has been in my cargo box for 2 months because I've been traveling so much. I was actually tallying it, and I think I've driven like 6,000 miles since I last recorded a podcast episode with Elena, like in late April. But glad to be here, finally in a place with stable Wi-Fi where I can actually bring my equipment out and dust it off. But sorry to folks for just being gone for so long and being a little bit Elena, you recorded an episode with Shugmani 2 and Sina, but other than that, we haven't been terribly productive at Power Hour. So apologies to all of our listeners for being absent, but we're back on schedule. We're going to be releasing Red Power Hour episodes every 2 weeks from now until forever, until we fall off the wagon again for whatever reason. But I'm actually really excited to be back talking about something super important with one of our Red Nation comrades, Nicole Martin. And why don't you introduce yourself here, Cole, and then I'll ask you, Elena, and then we'll talk a little bit more about today's topic.
Hello. My name is Nicole. I also go by Cole. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a member of the Red Nation, and I'm one of the co-founders and the sex educator for Indigenous Women Rising. Thank you for having me here on your Red Power Hour. I'm excited.
Have you been on the podcast, like either the Red Nation main feed or Red Power Hour before, Cole? I feel like you have.
Yeah, we did a movie episode, but I can't remember. I think it was about like different native movies, right, Elena? Something like that.
I think we did. I remember that it was with Justine and you and I and maybe Kylie. Yeah, it was our favorite movies and our least favorite movies. That was
That's
fun.
right. Aw. Okay. Well, Red Power Hour is going to be doing a lot more of those kinds of things. I guess Prey, which is the new Predator movie, is coming out this summer. It's going to be the talk of all of Indian country because the protagonist, like, it's like Predator versus this like badass indigenous huntress, a Comanche indigenous huntress, and so it's very indigenous. I mean, it might be super racist, but who knows? We'll watch it and we'll give you a review. I kind of feel like putting together like a watch party, like a Red Nation watch party, kind of reminiscent of when we did Kong versus Godzilla. It's like 20 of us were in a, well, I guess we can't really be in a room together, but we're watching that movie and then we all threw down about it. So I feel like it's going to be kind of like a big deal.
August 5th, it's coming to Hulu. And I was looking at it. It is going to be released entirely in Comanche. So that's probably not the mass release, but they will release it entirely in Comanche, which I was pretty excited about.
Well, if you want to come back, if you feel strongly about something like that, Cole, we should have you back to throw down about that movie. I'm sure there's going to be things we love and things we really hate about it. But as always, we'll give a indigenous and a left indigenous analysis of the way Native people are represented and kind of what this all means politically for everyone. But I just wanted to also give our Patreon pitch before we get into our conversation. Elena, I didn't even allow you to introduce yourself. Will you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Elena Ortiz. I'm calling in from Ogapoge, otherwise known as Santa Fe. And so I just want to make sure you know I'm not actually advocating getting tipsy. This shirt is actually, um, I'm going to give a shout out to the Three Sisters Collective who printed these shirts after we knocked down the obelisk in the plaza in the center of occupied Santa Fe. So getting tipsy was the obelisk that got tipsy and it got knocked down. So just so you know, I'm not advocating people drinking alcohol and listening to our podcast. Well, it might be better. I don't know.
I mean, you do you. You know, we accept it in all forms. But that was historic. That obelisk came down, what, like a year? Wait, 2020, year and a half ago, as part of the
Yep,
uprising.
it was Indigenous Peoples Day,
Aha,
and
2020.
yeah, got wibbly
Badass.
wobbly and went down.
Well, I did not say where I'm calling in from. I'm calling in from how do you pronounce it? Minnesota Makoche. I'm finally otherwise known as St. Paul, Minneapolis, which I'll be starting my new job at the University of Minnesota in a couple of months. And so just trying to find a house here. Um, this place is very beautiful. It's the water and the trees. Like, I'm Navajo, right? So like we don't really have water and trees like where I'm from. And so every day I'm just kind of like a kid in a candy shop, like in these Dakota homelands here. I don't know. I feel really, I just feel really lucky to be able to live in such a stunning place like this, where Mother Earth is. I mean, the life here is abundant. It's abundant and very beautiful. So I'm just happy to finally be here, also with some stable internet to record at Power Hour. But thank you, both of you. Really looking forward to our conversation. We have really quickly, we have 1,907 patrons, which is not up super high. It's probably up about 25 from when I last recorded 2 months ago. But nevertheless, every patron counts. We really appreciate everyone who's joined our Patreon since I last recorded in April. And I know that I've been making this pitch for like 2.5 years that we're almost there at the 2,000 patron mark to launch Native Reads, which is the next podcast series, Indigenous writers interviewing other Indigenous writers. And incidentally, Red Media just had its monthly editorial meeting today, and we were talking about Native Reads, and that is actually happening. There's a whole list of people that are participating, and so even though we haven't reached the 2,000 mark, we are preparing ourselves for being able to launch that podcast, and it will launch soon. Like, we're probably going to do it by the end of the summer. So please look out for that new podcast series. It's like we've been trying to work on it for 3 years or something like that. So that's really exciting. And thank you so much to everyone who has joined our Patreon recently. Share it with your friends, share the podcast, and yeah, let's keep boosting those numbers, because those numbers help to pay for lots of things. Mutual aid for in reservation communities everywhere, Navajo Nation, Pine Ridge, for cultural and spiritual and ceremonial activities, to assist families in need with things like funeral expenses for COVID-related passings or even firewood. And we also use that to employ an amazing team of working class Native women doing media work for Red Media. So yeah, please consider joining. You can find us on patreon.com. You can look us up under Red Media. And if you want to know more about the Red Nation, all three of us are members of the Red Nation. You can just go to therednation.org. So now that that is out of the way, everyone knows that the news has been really depressing about access to abortion in the United States. Obviously, this has been in the news a lot the last couple of months, and I've actually been wanting to do an episode on this for about a month now. Cole specializes not just in this issue, but in reproductive justice for Indigenous communities and Indigenous populations more specifically. And I just thought it would be a good idea for us to have kind of a free ranging kind of roundtable, Native women talking about this issue. I don't think I've heard that anywhere. No one really talks about what access to abortion means for Native populations. I found a couple of articles online, but the discourse, the progressive political discourse at least, about access to abortion is really dominated and dictated by white choice feminism. And while I'm, in full solidarity with that, I also feel like the terms of engagement and the way that it's framed really excludes Indigenous women's voices. And so I just wanted to dedicate this episode to talking about an issue that is very prevalent during the midterm election season. And as we move into a summer, I believe the Iowa Supreme Court just passed a law, or is about to pass a law, that will more strictly limit access to abortion in the state of Iowa. So it's not just happening at a federal and a national level, but it's happening at a state level. And of course, New Mexico, which is where Cole's work is based, and Cole lives in New Mexico, is buffered by like Oklahoma and Texas, for example, which have some of the strictest abortion laws in the country. And so it also affects folks, particularly women of color and Indigenous women, working class and poor folks from those states possibly needing to come into New Mexico to access services that they require. And so I know that people who are doing work on this in New Mexico are also facing kind of an unprecedented influx of populations in need, just because of what's happening politically. And, just misogyny and heteropatriarchy rearing its ugly head yet again, and gaining traction. So I wanted to maybe just start off by just giving you some time, Cole, to describe the work that you do, not just on this issue, but why you think it's important for Native people, and like what might be some concerns or things that we need to think about when it comes to Native people and access to abortion, that might be different actually than the way that it's framed or conceived of within kind of white stream feminism.
Thank you, Mel, for that introduction. I'll just introduce myself in Navajo real quick. Yata Esha Nicole Martin and Esha Tachini Nesha Kiesani Bashichi Chijudasche Kiesani Dashana. Hello, everyone. I introduced myself in Dinet Bazad. I'm running into the water born for Parrot Clan. My maternal grandfather was Chiricahua Apache, and my paternal grandfather was Lizard Clan. And I'm calling in from, well, I guess it would be considered Tamaya lands, which is like Santa Ana Pueblo, kind of like Rio Rancho area of New Mexico. Um, but yeah, so when I actually got into this work, I would say, like, doing abortion care work has been a part of my life for like 4 years now. 2018 was when I actually joined Indigenous Women Rising as a volunteer. And that same night was actually the launch of our abortion fund. Um, and we had a filming or screening at the Guild here in Albuquerque. And we were filming this documentary called Young Lakota. And um, I had remembered seeing it when I was attending um, my undergraduate at Fort Lewis College, and it kind of just opened up my mind to like abortion care. That's one thing that it's not really talked about when we talk about healthcare, or at least it's like the bad part of quote unquote bad part of healthcare, but it's still healthcare nonetheless, and it's actually one of the safest procedures that people could get. um, and so with that, like that night we raised like $500, and the way our abortion fund looks, because in the state of New Mexico, we have great access to abortion care. Medicaid covers abortion care. I helped repeal a ban last legislative session for 2021, making abortion care like ultimately like super safe for people to come. Because just knowing like the landscape of reproductive justice, right? That and healthcare, like there's a lot of policies that are being put in place that are like systemically continuing colonialism, I guess. You know, when we think about it, and I think that's what is different from mainstream and then white feminism, is the fact that like we're still experiencing ongoing colonialism, and like and it's probably most wicked form, right? In policy and in words, because you're fighting against words with like lived experiences. And a lot of people who are in positions of power don't have the lived experiences that we do. So I guess I was born. I was born to, continue to, I guess, when I look at and I reflect on the work that I've done, um, and our core values, right? As Indigenous people, of like being good relatives. Um, I'm just doing, you know, um, what our even like our tribal governments are lacking to do, right? Because like and for us, a lot of men, like cis gender heterosexual men, are in these positions of power, and they're for sure not having this conversation, right? um so I'm excited that we get to actually have this conversation, um about like and even within my own organization too, right? Like the men in my lives, like I have full support from some of the men in my lives, and other men are just straight up think I'm like rocking the boat or something, when I don't know. It's being in this position, like I feel like a lot of people think we're radical for what we do, but it's just like no. A lot of our relatives are facing financial barriers. They're facing safety, privacy concerns, and as Indigenous women, with high rates of like going missing and or murdered, sexual violence, assault, maternal mortality rates, as we were kind of having a pre-discussion earlier. Yet we're such a small percentage of the population. We're only, barely 2% population. Yet we have the highest percentage in like across the board for everything that's fucked up. But I feel like after, or I guess with what's going on, like I've been getting like inquiries about like what's going to happen with the landscape for Indigenous people if Roe v. Wade gets overturned. And I'm just kind of like, ask me something more nuanced, because this has been happening. Um, my abortion fund, the abortion fund that we have, like it wouldn't exist if people just had like access to the care that they needed, and if this wasn't a big deal to people. But it is, because I think it plays into um, religion a lot. And so the conversations that we see, right, and then that we hear, right, like around abortion care, like um I always get like people throw things in my face, like, well, you're like pushing the colonial agenda by like being pro-abortion or pro-choice. And it's just like, first of all, like we never even had, like, as Indigenous people, since colonization, we've never had like autonomy even over our own lives, like point blank, period. Like we've always had to struggle. We've lost a lot of relatives in the process. We've lost a lot of like land, life, animal life in the process to get where we are now. And we still don't have rights.
Yeah, I feel like there's this common refrain. It usually comes from men. Sometimes it comes from elders of varying genders. I'm talking about native folks. That like abortion isn't traditional. Like it's almost like a sin. It's kind of like they frame it like it's a sin because first of all, that's just Christianity. So I mean, get your facts straight. What constitutes tradition and what constitutes Christianity? But I think like the concept that somehow caring about Native women is considered radical or rocking the boat, or like somehow, right, it's not considered mainstream to care about Native women's autonomy and just like our safety. Because what you're talking about, it's just safety. It's just Native women feeling safe and having like free access to the things that we need in order to just live basic ass healthy lives. That's like all we're talking about here. And abortion care, the phrase abortion care, I don't know a lot about this issue. Like I do Indigenous feminism, but this like reproductive justice isn't kind of like my forte, I would say, when it comes to Indigenous feminism. So I'm going to take my guidance from the language you're using, Cole, just because you know more about this than I do. But abortion care just being an aspect of that larger spectrum of care that Native women have every right to have access to in order to live healthy, abundant, beautiful lives that Native women absolutely deserve to live. And then somehow we're just being constantly like told no, like whether it's by the system, whether it's by the men, like leaders in our own communities, or by men in our own families, and being like shamed out, or just being told that like it's just not possible for us to be able to have autonomy over our bodies, or over the destiny of our lives and like children, right? And just our families in general. Or if we even want to have a family, like a lot of Native women don't want to have families and we're shamed for not wanting to have families too. And so it's just like I feel like the misogyny comes from lots of different directions, and it's kind of a minefield, I would say, for Native women to navigate. And the fewer resources you have, which is the majority of Native women, the more challenging and desperate and depressing it actually is. And so I think when I think about like abortion care or just access to abortion, I'm thinking about the broad spectrum of care that Native women deserve and almost never receive.
And had prior to colonization, prior to colonialism, um, Native women healers had access um, to herbs and things that they understood could cause spontaneous abortions, and the knowledge and access to those places and those plants has been destroyed because of colonialism. People have been moved off their homelands. Traditional plants and medicines have been destroyed, and Cole mentioned that earlier. Like though that knowledge and the ability to do that was ours prior to colonization. And so we're not asking for something that we never had. We are trying to get back our own sovereignty over our own bodies. And to have religion, yeah, religion is huge. And in my communities in the pueblos, you know, we have there's a church in every pueblo. And so yes, if you're talking about abortion, with the elders, male or female or non-binary, you're going to come up against that Catholic Church and you're going to get told it's a sin. But it wasn't a sin until Jesus Christ came to Turtle Island. It was just women taking care of ourselves and other women. It was us being in community and in solidarity. And there were times when women did not want to carry a child to term, and there was no quality. Um, there was no qualitative judgment on that. It was a choice without sin or without this evil that Christianity brought. And, it didn't exist here. So I think it's really sad when we start running up as Indigenous women that we have to start, justifying what we always had prior to colonization.
I think that's a great point, Elena, and that's kind of I hope people are able to find this documentary, Young Lakota, because that documentary followed um, Cecilia Fire Thunder when she was the president on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And at the time, I think it was 2014, the state of South Dakota was in the process of putting like a statewide abortion ban. And so the documentary follows Cecilia Fire Thunder, really kind of uh, uh, bringing back that women helping women, right? Women being in solidarity with one another. And what her campaign included was a women's healthcare facility being built that would provide abortion care. However, um, that was such a controversial opinion and like religion comes into play. You could see that in the documentary. That rapper Lightfoot, or I don't know his first name. I just know him as Lightfoot. But
I
the
haven't heard
guy,
that dude's name in like 20 years.
yeah, so he does. So like in the documentary, he's doing like a tour, right? And he's actually like he's like a religious rapper. So like he was yeah. Anyways, it's a very interesting documentary. Needless to say that like Cecilia Fire Thunder ends up getting impeached because of that campaign, and her vice president ended up building the women's healthcare facility, but it just didn't provide abortion care. And so that's why I was just kind of like, when you bring up that great point, right? Like, even when we're in solidarity with one another or just things like that, somehow patriarchy and misogyny and like religion find a way to like still try to pit us against one another. And it's hard because, like, we have like data, like, um, the Navajo Nation and North and South Dakota are like our main um, geographic areas that we get callers from. So when I have done the interviews, I told like people, uh, we've been doing this work since 2018. Like, we've been funding people traveling outside of their home state to go to a different state since 2018, and like it only has gotten like more um, and more influx after the passage of SB 8 in Texas. And at that point in our abortion fund, we had adapted it to the material conditions, which was COVID, and then SB 8's abortion ban. So we have like our Indigenous Fund. It funds relatives who are in the United States and in Canada, but who come from Canada to United States to receive their care. So that's where like our eligibility, right? Like, um, uh, we do have a part in our eligibility that asks for like a CIB, or like, because we know that like some of our relatives aren't enrolled, or like their tribes are federally, they're not federally recognized. So we have like, do you have pictures of you in regalia? Do you have like a community member who can like write a letter on your behalf or something like that? Because we have received callers who are like, but I'm native to America. And I'm just like, that's not how it works. That's not how it works. And so like we've had people try to like find ways, I guess, to like scam us through our abortion fund. And so we've we're always constantly, I guess, like re-strategizing it and making it adapt to our material conditions. And so when COVID came and then SB 8 came, we saw an influx of non-Indigenous callers. So we started funding Black and migrating relatives and youth under 18. We've always funded trans and non-binary relatives um, as a part of our abortion fund, because we realize that women aren't the only ones who are having abortion procedures. And so um, but after that, our funds started getting depleted, and we took a month break in April of this year, from April 1st to May 16th. And we decided, and during that time, we were re-strategizing and fundraising, because a lot of the funds like come from fundraising. Like, we have working class people who are monthly donors, and they donate like $5 to $8 a month, right? But like anything helps, because like when you get to like procedure costs, those are super expensive. If you have to travel out of state, that's super expensive. Gas is like what, way like over $5 now, almost $7 in some places. And um you know, you have to think of, or if they get like flights, right, then you think about hotels. So our fund, like it's like a case, it depends on like what their needs are really. So like if somebody does need like travel expenses and things like that, like that's where we can come in and help. And um practical support like food, childcare, gas if need be. And like I was having a conversation with my executive director, Rachel Lorenzo, who originally founded Indigenous Women Rising. And they were saying that, like, on average, for just like basic, like just basic care, on average per caller is like $1,500. And then that doesn't include like other things that they would need, right? And um, it's just, it's wild because when I do have this conversation with like non-indigenous people, they don't realize like, hey, there are so much more barriers than they thought there would be for people to get the care, just basic care. Or like telling them about they always want to like follow a story, or like be like, can we follow someone and blah blah blah. And I'm like, no, hell no. Like that's like a safety issue, that's a safety concern. And like we don't, I always tell them like we don't exploit our callers for their stories. You know, like that's not the reason why we have it. Like they trust us enough to come to us in the first place. And so we don't want to break that trust by being like, hey, here's, can this camera guy follow you? Like, that's just so ridiculous. And I don't know, asinine for them to like even think to like ask me. And so I'm just, mm, it's, it's wild. Um, because we're like, as I was saying, we're such a small percentage, yet it affects us so deeply. And we're always like the last, we're always the afterthought. We're the afterthought because now you see other reporters or like people being like, well, what indigenous people, like they have sovereignty, can't they like build clinics and things like that? And I'm just like, wow, we only care when you think that we're going to help you. Like you guys can't even help yourselves. So it's, and I think also too, another reason why I brought up Young Lakota is because that's the first, I feel like, example. um if people are like, well, can't indigenous people put their own clinics on, you know, in their communities? And it's like, yeah, we would love to reclaim, like bringing that care back to the community of helping one another like on our own terms and in our own ways. But the way that history has gone, you know, we have Indian health services that, um, you know, can, they're also limited to what they can provide for indigenous people. And in the pre-discussion, Elena was talking about, you know, what I, go for it, Elena.
Well, yeah, let's talk about, because I also want to circle back around to something Cole said earlier, but let's talk about, someone who says that, can't you have sovereignty, which is a whole other level of discussion, which we could have, probably not here and not today. But why can't you just fund your own clinics? Great. Give us back our land from sea to shining sea, so from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and we will fund our own clinics. Otherwise, given that y'all stole that land, and part of the treaty says that we are entitled to health care, which, as any Native person will tell you, is pathetic, um, non existent in most places, and and really severely underfunded. Um, and really just not accessible to many people who live on the reservation or um, urban native people who might live in a big city that don't have access to Indian Health Service. And then let's go back even further to what the Indian Health Service did in the 60s and 70s, which was mass sterilization of Native women. And there's an estimate that about 25% of Native women who gave birth in an IHS hospital during the 60s and 70s were sterilized without their consent. So, forced sterilization of Native women. And you wonder why Native women don't trust the Indian Health Service with their reproductive rights. Um, and we were also talking about this earlier. That is why WARN, Women of All Red Nations, was founded to protect, warn, inform Native women of what was happening and protect our reproductive rights. And it took years for them to actually reverse that trend of Native women being sterilized. Um, Also, the Hyde Amendment, which passed in 1980, prohibits federal funding for abortion care. Since our clinics on the reservations are federally funded, they cannot fund abortion care. So Native women have no options. If and it doesn't matter if you are living on the Navajo res, if you're living in a pueblo, if you're living in Minneapolis, St. Paul, if you don't have access to an Indian Health Service, you don't get care. But even if you do, you won't get abortion care because it's against the law. And Cole, you mentioned something that I want to circle back to, which is a lack of abortion care also contributes to missing and murdered Indigenous women, because you have women who are, desperate to have this kind of care, and it's not accessible in their own communities, and so they're trying to get other places, and that's when you have a lot of women going missing, is in these contexts. And it's a whole cycle of um, of sadness that starts with us just not being able to take care of our own people, of our own women, in the way that we should, because we don't have access to the funding that we need. We don't have access to the teachings that we need from our elders, from those who came before, and we're not able to caretake one another in the way that we should be. And so all of this is exacerbated, and it has, just a splinter effect on women's healthcare and women's reproductive rights in general. And I was very fortunate in that I have two kids. They were born at the Santa Fe Indian Hospital before obstetrics was removed from the hospital, because there was no funding for it. And so my kids were born with, we had midwives, and the way it should be done, traditional births without medical intervention unless absolutely necessary. You don't have that anymore, and it's all because of funding. And this funding is tied into to treaties, which we all know are not being honored anywhere, any shape, any form. So all of this is tied together. It's all related to land back. Like, give us our land back. Let us fund clinics for women. Let us reclaim our natural healers, and have them teach us how to take care of one another.
Hell yeah. I mean, the history of mass sterilization, it's like, let me backtrack. I mean, pretty much every point of contact that Native women have with institutions, whether it's institutions of the state like hospitals or schools, um, or even getting a driver's license, right? Those types of things, but also the points of contact we have with our own nations. It's just really overdetermined by heteropatriarchy. And like it's kind of just facing constant obstacles and limitations and being told no. And it's like the opposite of care. It's very anti-woman. I would say it's very the general world in which we live as Native women in the world we have to navigate is one that is really anti us, to be honest. And of course, it gets worse the less income we have, right? And the less financial or like social and economic stability we have, which is the majority of Native women in Turtle Island today. And so, in addition to mass sterilization, which is like something that happened 50 years ago, right? Even though it now has an intergenerational legacy, of course, even today, for example, in Canada, like the apprehension of children at childbirth, like as soon as many Indigenous women, First Nations women give birth in hospitals, their children are apprehended by the state and taken away from them and then put into an incredibly racist colonial foster care system. And there's a large conversation, right? We're talking about abortion today, but there's also a huge national conversation in the US happening about boarding schools right now, right? And so this is also something I think Nick actually did an episode on this that was either released or is going to be released soon. And so these are two huge topics, I would say, for Native people right now in Turtle Island, specifically the US. But something that a lot of people don't know is that there are actually more Indigenous children in the custody of the state in Canada today than there was at the height of the residential school era in that country, that settler state. And that is specifically because of the way that Native women are profiled and treated when they come into a hospital to give birth to their children. And so, if we're going to be talking about a woman's choice not to have a child, right? Abortion, then we also have to be talking about all of these other things that continue to happen to Native women when it just comes to reproduction, right? And reproductive justice and reproductive rights. In my mind, I think often what happens, like the way that Roe v. Wade has been framed and the way that white mainstream feminism has always framed abortion is that it's an issue that's siloed off from other issues, or it's like an add-on kind of thing. So it's like, if you're a progressive, then you're like pro-choice, right? And like, that's how you frame it. But like, when it comes to Native women, you can't talk about abortion without talking about like the broad spectrum of reproductive justice. Like Cole said earlier, you can't talk about abortion without talking about not even the legacy of settler colonialism, like the ongoing fact that the state steals Indigenous children. I mean, Texas, anti-abortion, like notoriously anti-abortion. Texas is also, right, trying to make it so that Native children can't be placed with Native families, according to that law. That law also had to be fought for by Indigenous women, just the way that Warren came into existence to have to fight to stop mass sterilizations. And so I'm an Indigenous feminist, right? We're doing like Native Women Freestyle here in RPH. This is like a Native feminist kind of oriented podcast and political kind of analysis of these issues. And if you're going to talk about Indigenous feminism, the history of Indigenous feminism as both a political and an intellectual project comes directly from grassroots Native women-led effort, heroic fucking efforts, right, to just ensure the basic safety and rights of Native women, whether it has to do with mass sterilization, whether it has to do with like foster care, like the racist institutions of foster care, or like MMIWG, right? Or the fact that there are almost no domestic violence shelters in like large land-based nations like the Navajo Nation. And so it's really like the entire spectrum of precarity, I would say, precarity and violence that Native women we have to basically navigate that every single day. And so safety, access to safe care, and just goddamn care, just care in general, and whatever that means, is like such a huge issue. And like, even that is like, you would think that that's like the base, like the minimum. That should be just like the minimum that any human being should expect to encounter, even in their own families, or in these institutions. And Native women, like, let's be real, like, no one cares about Native women. The only people who care about Native women are other Native women. And that's why these histories and these legacies of Indigenous feminism, that's the only reason why this shit exists in the first place. That's the only reason why people like me like have access to certain things and am even able to call myself an Indigenous feminist in 2022. It's really only because Native women have been fighting for Native women for a really long time. And this is just another fight, right? This is another generational fight for Native women to have just like basic fucking rights as human beings. Um, I feel like the abortion, like the conversation about access to abortion is related to like the rise of traditional doulas. Like we have a lot of powerful, beautiful Native women in the Southwest who've been bringing back these practices in the Navajo Nation and in the Pueblos. Three Sisters, who you mentioned earlier, talking about the obelisk as part of this work. I think we're in a moment where there is like mobilization happening at a grassroots level where Native women are really throwing down for each other to be able to provide this access and this care, even though sometimes it's illegal. Like even having like a home birth is illegal in some places. And a home birth for a Native woman who wants to do it in a way that is like culturally and ceremonially um, bound, right? Like a traditional type of childbirth, you actually aren't allowed to do that in certain places. And so if a woman is wanting to do that, let's say in the Navajo Nation, she's actually not allowed to. And so to be able to have those practices is still like kind of clandestine in some ways, which again is just like, what the fuck? it's traditional childbirth is criminalized. Okay, cool.
Well,
Let's just like pile on.
we're still being controlled by the state. I mean,
Yeah.
if you want to have a home birth and you wanted to do it with someone, and I'm talking, 25 years ago, because I looked into it. If you want to have it, you have to have a license, someone who's licensed by the state to witness the birth. Otherwise, your child doesn't exist. You can't get a birth certificate. You can't get a CIB. Now that's changing, but you could, because as Mel said, we're having, there are more indigenous women who are becoming doulas and midwives and doing this kind of work, but they're also licensed, and so the state is still controlling it. The state still controls everything we do. Everything we do with our bodies is controlled by the state. And Mel, you touched on something too, which I think is really important when we talk about abortion care. Is that yes, there is so much violence within indigenous communities, and the statistics were 1 in 3 indigenous women is going to be raped or sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and a lot of those have resulted in unwanted pregnancies. So when we're talking about abortion care, and when we're talking about the health of the mother, or the I don't want to be a mother, you're also talking about mental health. Like, how can you force a young woman to carry to term a rapist's child, or a child of incest? I mean, those are things that have to be faced up to. And so it's not just someone was irresponsible on a Saturday night. I mean, this is what all the anti-abortion motherfucking white people, Christian men in particular, it's always the Christian men, are saying, well, you should just use birth control if you don't want to have a child. Well, that's not what
You
we're
should
talking
stop
about.
wearing skirts.
Exactly,
Like,
exactly.
fuck
You
you.
know, we're talking about um, you know, we're talking about community care for a woman who does not want to bring a child to term, and it's for their mental health and their emotional and their psychological health. All of these things factor in, and whatever Jesus lovers throw at you, it has nothing to do with with what we focus on being good relatives. Is how can we support what this woman wants to do with her body and with her life. And that's the most important thing. And in so many cases, that is not even thought about. It's all caught up in all of this God and sin and other stuff. And particularly, when you look at places in the South, in the deep South, Texas being one of them, it's not that they're not going to get abortions. They're just all going to come to New Mexico.
Yeah, the people that we fund that live in Texas, they come to New Mexico, or they go to Denver, Colorado, or if they live closer to the Oklahoma state line, they go to Oklahoma, but then Oklahoma is also enforcing bans and things like that. And that's what really I think people too don't understand is that like along with the ban, some states are putting in like you have to have a mandatory like ultrasound, right? So like just like all of these other things like adding on to um, like the barriers of like just getting a procedure for abortion and um, you know, our relatives don't have that kind of funding. They don't even have that kind of support system in their homes, you know. And so when I get asked like, well, what is our plan, right? Like, what are we gonna do if it gets overturned? And we're like, we're gonna continue to still fund abortion care, you know, even if that my executive director went on Twitter saying like, hey, I'm ready to accept the financial and legal risks that come along with this. And I was like, yeah. Sitting there, I'm like, yeah, I'm sure there's, you know, people that have been wanting and waiting to like sue us for a really long time or something, you know? And it's just like, but no matter what, like, we know that since the federal government, the state and local government, and even our tribal governments aren't going to do it, that we're going to be the ones that are doing it. And like, you know, we're just honored and grateful that we have like the trust in our community members who do reach out for our help. And like I hope if anything that shows people like, hey, that's like the power in community, and that's like the power when you let people make decisions over their own lives, like. And I think that's um like with I wanted to circle back right with what you were discussing earlier, Elena, about like how um you know, and Mal, like how like our ancestors have been fighting for this for a really long time, right? Like I was a co-chair for this coalition, um Respect New Mexico Women Coalition for Choice, and it had like 20 plus organizations, which three of the abortion funds, which is Indigenous Women Rising, Mariposa Fund. They fund undocumented relatives seeking abortion care. They're here in New Mexico, so they probably saw way more influx after Texas, the SB8 ban. And then there's another abortion fund called the New Mexico Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. They're like a faith-based coalition that, you know, advocates and helps people get abortion care. They actually like have a lot more capacity in the sense of like they have people who volunteer to drive patients to their appointments, pick them up across state borders, and take them to their appointments here in New Mexico. Um, how like some people offer like their houses like for people to stay so that they could like have a home cooked meal and things like that. And so it's just like the ways that we're thinking about providing care for one another like really has gone to show like the power that we you know that we have when we come together to take care of one another. And like when we repealed the abortion bans in 2021, those were from 1969, and there were like three statutes that criminalized abortion care. And like um it was for me this coalition that I was a co-chair for was predominantly like like it has a bunch of old white women in it, you know, like old white retired women, you know, and like other people from like ACLU or Planned Parenthood, like other orgs that have like bigger budgets, right? Like, and so it was a very interesting experience trying to be a co-chair for that coalition, because I don't think they ever had leadership from Indigenous. My co-chair was a Black woman, and so like Indigenous Black queer leadership, and they struggled a lot, and they struggled a lot to like follow our leadership. And the fact that like we also were like a part of doing direct action, you know, like we weren't just like talking about it, we were out there being about it too. And like we get stalked, we get targeted a lot. And so but I always tell people like I ain't fucking scared of you, like, come at me, bro. Like, and so with that, like when the passage passed, right, there was like some weird internal drama. They're like, oh, but this organization didn't get mentioned by Michelle Lujan Grisham, right? Or whatever, right? And then it was just like, hey, I didn't have access to what Michelle Lujan Grisham had. Like I didn't have access to any of that. And so it was just like, and then they were like, we've been working on this forever and like all this stuff. And then I was like, yeah, so have my ancestors. My ancestors have been working on this for a really long time. And like, I don't think they like that, but that was just the reality, Like I never I never want white women to think that they had the first idea because they didn't. I want them to know that like everything that they've advocated for has always been because of indigenous or black or LGBTQ relatives who were fighting for that recognition in the first place, too.
Facts. This is Cole just spitting facts. I have so many thoughts that are possibly unrelated to each other, but I'm just gonna stream of consciousness do right now. But you made me think like what you guys are doing with Indigenous women rising with your abortion fund. You said something earlier about how people are like, well, you guys have sovereignty. Like, why don't you build clinics for this type of care? And you said, Cole, uh, you guys only care when we can help you. You can't even help yourself. First of all, that's the entire history of settler colonialism. Like, I mean, that wouldn't have, if Native people hadn't been like vastly more competent and skilled than early settlers, like the United States would have never happened. And just like really like, settlers were super pathetic and didn't know what they were doing. And this continues to be the case, right? With that kind of mentality and that framework with this issue. But the reason why I'm saying that is that, like, yeah, that is all about kind of a settler mentality about this issue. But also, what you are doing in IWR is true sovereignty, because this is what we talk about in the Red Deal, right? It's like the world that we envision from an Indigenous left feminist perspective is a world in which many worlds fit. And it's where, like, an Indigenous feminist view of the world that has a different set of values is the basis for how we build institutions and we interact with each other and have relationships. That's a world where everyone's needs are met, right? That's a world where everyone is cared for, and you don't discriminate against people based on, like what's some sort of like hierarchy of value, like racial capitalism, how racial capitalism works. And so what you're doing is essentially like that in practice. And I think for me, that's really like what Indigenous feminism is at its base. It's that right there. It's true sovereignty, because like the Jonathan Nez is like the Navajo Nation president who's a Christian. They don't do shit. Like they're like, I don't know, they're really mediocre compared to the heroic Indigenous women like you and the people you work with who are doing the real work of sovereignty, in my perspective. Um, but something else that I wanted to touch on is it feels like I feel like we've been made to think of abortion care as exceptional. Like it's like an exceptional thing that we have to talk about in our political work, or it's like an exceptional thing that we have to talk about when it comes to healthcare. It holds like such a unique position within the broader spectrum of care, or just healthcare, the notion of care in general. And that just feels really manufactured to me, because we opened up the whole podcast conversation. Elena, you said, and this is true, that back in the day, there were herbs and there were methods for carrying, if a woman did not want to carry a child to term, she didn't have to. And there was a whole spectrum of care to assist her with that choice. And that it wasn't like, it wasn't a sin. It actually wasn't viewed as anything negative. If there was ever any kind of adverse spiritual impact because of that choice, that was taken care of in the way that it needed to be taken care of, so that both she and the community could move forward in a positive way, but it was never, from what I can tell, it was never like this exceptionally bad thing, or it wasn't even an exceptional thing. It was just part of the course of life. It was part of the course of like what it means, to like have sex and like, all of the things that human beings do in societies. And so I feel like, in a way, like part of the work is de-exceptionalizing abortion and then talking about a broader spectrum of care that actually values Native women, right? And if we're able to start from that point, then I think it just allows us to like understand things in a different way. Because I feel like in the history of the Red Nation, when things have been most powerful, like when we've done really powerful campaigns like the Indigenous Peoples Day campaign in 2015, in my mind, I always thought about it as like, these are the terms of engagement that we're being given and that we're being fed by people with power. And it's like, I'm going to refuse. I'm going to refuse the way that you're framing this, because I don't actually think that this is liberatory. I don't think that this is feminist, right? And I don't really think this is particularly Indigenous. So if I'm going to refuse what you're telling me is the way that I'm supposed to be thinking about this, and I'm supposed to be acting on this as like a revolutionary and as an activist, and instead, what if we changed and shifted the terms of engagement to the orientation that actually allows us to talk about liberation, right? Um, to talk about this particular issue within a framework of Indigenous feminist liberation, then that is like a way to shift the conversation that allows an opening for something different to emerge, right? And so I think I'm just thinking, based on the work that you do, Cole, on the ground, and how that helps us to shift how we're even talking, I think, about abortion care, um, and to de-exceptionalize it, because I think an Indigenous feminist perspective would actually be much more interested in like like the broader spectrum of care. And we talk a lot about care. We talk a lot about the politics of care in the Red Deal that isn't just attached to like cisgender, like women's bodies, but that care has to be like a value shift. And I think that's one of like the really incredible contributions, I think, of Indigenous feminism to this larger conversation about reproductive justice.
Absolutely. I mean, and what if we started out? You talk about de-exceptionalizing it, um, destigmatizing it as well. Like, this is part of your conversation. How whoever is involved in that conversation as young people, and I'm not just talking, you know, um, like all spectrums, non-binary, men, women, girls, boys. This is sex education. This is also, what do you do if you find yourself, like, there are so many things that are available um, to people with the money to access them. There's the morning after pill. There's various kinds of birth control. Access is the issue. So, what if they were accessible to all people, and these things were just made part of the conversation? And if you find yourself pregnant with an unwanted pregnancy, these are your options. If you think you need the morning after pill, here it is. Here's how you get it. And cost wouldn't be an issue. If you find yourself further down the line and you need access to an abortion, this is how you get it. This is not stigmatized by religion or by what society tells you. These are just the options, and everybody needs to have access to free, safe, um, and community supported options. Like, that's what we should be looking at.
Yeah, definitely. And like, I know that our my organization has definitely been known for the abortion care, or like mostly abortion fund, because we're not providers, we're not providing these procedures. We're just really good fundraisers. I guess is like what I could say. And I guess, relatives that people feel comfortable enough to like reach out to. We have ongoing relationships with the patient, or I call them patients, but like our callers, and like, sending them like aftercare packages and things like that. Just because we know, like, you know, this decision that they, or this experience that they've gone through can feel so like lonesome and lonely, or just like, and I appreciate both, like what both of y'all said about like destigmatizing and de-exceptionalizing it, right? Because like I always feel that, like, why do you know, I take on the role of like having to talk to people to just be like, hey, why is it so hard to recognize another person's humanity, or like, basic human, decent, treating another person with basic human decency, really. I in 2020, when we had our like in-person legislative sessions, we were lobbying for the repeal then, and I I had talked to my senator who was for Casablanca, or like, no, it actually be Cibola County. And so like we got into a real like heated argument, um because he he fucked up by telling me that like his wife had an abortion story. And I was like, okay, well, your wife, that your wife could have died if she didn't have this procedure that's like saved her life. I was like, but you want to deny other people who could potentially be in that same situation that same right or access. And so we just got into like, he was like, well, Roe v. Wade is like the supreme law of the land. And I was like, as an indigenous person, that doesn't mean shit to me, because like it's on stolen land, and like all of that is a fallacy. And then we just started going down this like rabbit hole of, he's like, well, I'm older than you, and like all of these things, and like I'm a man. And I'm just like, what the fuck? Like, so we were like literally like yelling at each other, and like I walked out of his office crying, because like, I mean, I'm an emotional person, but I get way more emotional when I can't like react on my anger, or like react on the violence that I feel inside me, Like, I'm in the roundhouse, first of all, so I probably would have been like tackled by like security or something. But like, I don't know. It was really upsetting to have somebody that um was voted in by like constituents who had their own personal abortion care story, and didn't have the same empathy for, or didn't even think to have the same empathy for other people that could be in that situation too. And I'm just like, ugh. I used to get really mad and like real like down on myself when I thought about it, but I'm just like, there's always going to be those people that, just are so stuck in their own ways, I guess, like with blinders on, that they can't see that like somebody else needs help too.
Yeah, and I've been, I don't, I try not to follow politics particularly at this point in my life, but um, I was just shaking my head a few weeks ago because that stupid weatherman is now running for governor of the state of New Mexico. And yeah, I don't care one way or the other about Michelle Lujan Grisham. But one thing I do know is that she is pro choice. And um, dingbat weatherman is not. And so, I think in the back of my mind as I'm looking at this headline, I'm in the grocery store and Ron Ketty is the GOP choice to run against Michelle Lujan Grisham. And I'm like, son of a bitch. you know, like, so now, what's going to happen if he does win the gubernatorial election, and then are we going to have New Mexico, are they going to ban abortion in New Mexico, and providing that, that Roe v. Wade is overturned, which I think is almost a given right now. Then, I my heart goes out, like, to any and all women in the state of New Mexico. And it just, it kind of blows my mind, because I grew up in a generation where Roe v. Wade was the law of the land. And um, it was one of those things uh, that you didn't really think about growing up in the 80s, that abortion was legal, and it was, if you could afford it, it was safe. um, as Indigenous women, and I know there were many Indigenous women who um, grew up like I did, believing that it was going to last forever. And now we're looking at it, and we're looking back and saying it's neither safe nor affordable, and now it may actually be illegal.
Do you feel like this is like the slingshot, like the reactionary slingshot to like Me Too and the rising tide of like queer feminism? I would say in the past, maybe what probably even just the last 5 years, like things have really changed politically and culturally in the United States around gender and sexuality, much more progressive. And so I think like we've talked a lot about fascism, and different kinds of iterations of fascism on Red Power Hour. Like the Trump's election, the pushback against the uprising of 2020, and against Black Lives Matter. And so I think this is partly what's happening. And I think it might be helpful for people who are just like careening from the constant like whiplash, I think, of like the back and forth between like revolutionary force and reactionary force, that's kind of like the engine of history in a way. And so we're in a bit of like a juggernaut or a tug of war. And I think that's what happens under like unstable political conditions. And even whilst it's like very draconian from like a Handmaid's Tale kind of perspective, what it also implies to me is that there's a real struggle for power. And that's not a bad place to be, because it means that we have power. Like that's what this means. When the establishment tries to like really buckle down on something that we thought was like a given, like Roe v. Wade, that means that they're like circling the proverbial wagons, right? They know that like they actually have to fight really hard to maintain power, which means that they like don't have all of the power that they used to have. And that's a fucking great position to be in, because they're precarious. And even though they're winning in some ways, I mean, if abortion is banned or revoked or whatever in New Mexico, you should fucking riot. That's what you should do. That's what people should do. Like there could be another kind of revolutionary uprising because of this. And it's just, time will tell like what people are willing to tolerate and what they're not willing to tolerate. But I just wanted to kind of like give that final comment from my perspective that I know things are incredibly unstable and horrifying. And there's so much terrorism. Like there's like school shootings, there's like this stuff. It's like a very scary time, I think, to be a person of this kind of orientation in life in this country in particular. But it is also happening because there is a real power struggle happening, and that's not, like I said, that's not a bad position to be in. It just means that like the good and humble people of the earth need to keep pushing and mobilizing for, right, a world that's an alternative world that isn't based on violence, that isn't based on racism and white supremacy and all of and heteropatriarchy and misogyny. And I'm incredibly encouraged by the election in Colombia and like what's happening in the global south, particularly our relatives in South America and Latin America, because they have real movements. And like that, whatever's happening down there, oh my God, like they are a force to be reckoned with. And that is a beautiful thing to see, even though we're kind of a mess here in Turtle Island. I feel like we are, like, we meaning like the movement or whatever. It's very fragmented. There's a lot of fatigue. I think there's a lot of defeatism at the moment. Um, that other people don't share that with us. You know, there are people in Latin America who are doing beautiful, heroic things in the millions upon millions, and we can look to them for inspiration and we can link up with their struggles. But also, like, you know, the work that you're doing, Cole, with IWR, like what even the Red Nation is doing on a smaller scale, that there are those of us who are still carrying, what does D say? We're carrying the team on our backs through whatever this upheaval that's happening, and hopefully, you know, hopefully with there's another rebellion against all of this to push back against the tide that is coming at us right now. As long as we like paddle, just keep afloat with the tide that's happening. But guess, like, for damn sure, there's gonna be a punch back. We're getting punched really hard right now, but we're also gonna punch back. And so I look forward to the next time that happens in a major way in Turtle Island.
Yeah, I agree. Like I definitely agree. Like there's that power struggle, right? And like um the elite are like feeling it because you can see what the greatest example is with Oklahoma, right? Like they lost they lost a lot of land, right? And it's now like tribal land, right? And so now when I think what is I don't even know what his name is. Governor something said like, you know, that he thinks that indigenous people are going to try to have like clinics on the land or something like that, and like that'll never happen or something like that, and just like trying to devalue like indigenous people and their sovereignty. um it, that is just like one of many of like, yeah, this is like where people are starting, or like people like the 1% are trying to like be like, hey, we're losing control, we're losing. And i I do too feel strongly that like our communities are gonna be that uppercut that just knocks them out, and like they just get knocked out, and I'd be over there like Smokey from Friday and be like, you got knocked the fuck out, and just like walk away, you know? Like I look forward to that day too, and I'm just like so excited that, you know, we have we have community and we have relatives who are willing to um to do that for one another, right? Like, and it doesn't just have to be abortion care, right? Like that's why like I'm a part of the Red Nation, just because I know that my organization really gets known for abortion care, but we also have a midwifery fund, which um kind of it's like the other part where we know that midwives don't get paid shit through insurance. So the fund is supposed to help, you know, families find that midwife and doula if they want a doula, and we just reimburse them. We just reimburse them for their supplies, their time, and all of that, because Medicaid or, you know, insurance doesn't do that. And so we have that, and we have our midwife is Melissa Rose. I believe you know them, Elena. Yeah, and so like um, she actually, I think it was like sometime last month, but she had went to a training to learn how to do abortion procedures. So we're trying to also like figure out like to um, how to get on that, I guess, right? If even if we then we can be like, hey, now we have a provider, we have like our own person too, right? Who's an indigenous person, and like just the way that like, you know, my organization too, and along with the Red Nation and a lot of like our other, you know, like Three Sisters Collective, Table Women United, you know, Pueblo Action Alliance, like all of the work that we're doing is reproductive justice. And like I and reproductive justice, like the term itself, actually came from Sister Song, which is a black founded and led organization. And so reproductive justice comes from Sister Song. And um, basically, they define reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And I believe that like all of the work from like the organizations we've mentioned and a lot of the organizations across the country, you know, that are like fighting for the people, like that's what reproductive justice is. And like yeah, we can't just talk about, you know, abortion care without the environmental conditions we live in, um, whether that be, you know, near fracking sites or in the inner cities, right? Like people shouldn't have to, and this is what y'all talk about, we talk about in the Red Deal, like people shouldn't have to fundraise just to live decent lives. You know, you don't see the military, you don't see the police or like other places having to fundraise just so that they can live, right? Like, no way our freaking governments give them money like, I don't know, like some silver plate kid, like, who's like, can I have $100? Like, you know what I mean? So, I know that with Roe v. Wade, I feel like people like there's like they feel like an impending doom, at least with a lot of like the other organizations, like abortion funds and things like that. But I always just remind them like, hey, you know, we've been fighting this for a really long time, and we continue to fight it, you know, until this system is dismantled, or like I don't know, until it goes up in flames like the cathedral in Notre Dame, but this time it actually like burns all the way down. So I'm excited, you know, I'm excited in the fact that I have some down ass fucking people on my side, and that our love for the people supersedes like the hate that colonialism has for us.
Mic drop. That's perfect ending. Like, thank you, Cole, for being here. This was amazing. This was a really good conversation. It lightened my spirit and my heart because I get down sometimes about what's happening in the world. And I just encourage everyone to just like keep your chin up, keep fighting, keep giving hope to yourself and to everyone around you. Like, if Indigenous women are telling you that there's still hope and to keep fighting, then that's all you need. Because that's literally why Indigenous women are around today, because that's all we do. That's like our bread and butter. It's what we do for everybody in our lives. And I hope we've done it for you today. And I can't wait for that like Indigenous left feminist knockout punch, because that's what we deliver here at Red Power Hour and with the Red Nation. We'll share donation links for the work that Cole does and also for Red Nation in the social media for this podcast episode. But thank you again for listening. You can find us again and donate to Red Media's work for Indigenous media at patreon.com/redpaper, PPR. Never mind, don't listen to me. Just look up Red Media. Patreon.com. But I look forward to talking with you all again sometime soon. Thanks.